Perfect. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen with you just to show you and let me rewind for a second. The format of our tests in psychology is going to be based off of like an AP FRQ. The reason being is that this is the first half of AP psychology, and it's just a way to provide kind of a common structure throughout the course so that there's like, we're not jumping back and forth between the actual like format of the test. So I'm going to show you what the 2019 AP FRQ looked like, so you have a sense of kind of like what it's going to look like. For those of you who have maybe taken an AP class in your past, when I say FRQ within psychology, it's a little bit different than some of the other classes. It's free response question is what FRQ stands for. And it's not an essay, right? You don't have to like make it pretty. It doesn't have to have like an introduction or a conclusion. You just have to answer the question and touch base on all of the points that they are asking you to touch base on. So with that, like I said, I'm going to share my screen with you here real quick. So this is what the 2019 FRQ looks like. There's always going to be like I'm blanking on what the actual terminology, like a scientific study. You have to interpret some sort of scientific study. That's always going to be, and again, we're talking AP. You may not be taking the AP test. You may not be taking the AP class. That's fine. This is still going to be the structure of our questions, again, to maintain that consistency. So there's always going to be one that's based on scientific study. So that's basically unit 1. So this is something that you could potentially see on this first chapter's FRQ, right? It's asking you to look for a dependent variable, hypothesis, right? Naturalistic observation. All of these things are what we're covering in chapter 1 of psychology. So you'll see here that they'll provide you with some sort of situation, and then they'll ask you to identify a certain amount of vocab terms or whatever that might be. Here's another example. This is later on in content, but like, again, here we see a specific situation or a scenario, and then describe how each of the following concepts relates to return to working at the library, right? And then you'll have to go through and define and connect each of these terms. So in your FRQ, in the chapter 1 FRQ, it's not going to be timed. I'm doing that so that you can kind of get a sense of what the format is like. You can use your notes. You can do whatever to make yourself as successful as possible in terms of content. Again, with the intent of your units 2 or your chapters 2 and 3 FRQ and on are going to be timed. So you're going to have to be focusing on recall and actually like knowing the content and not being concerned about the format. So that's kind of the structure here and like my thought process behind giving you no time limit, chapter 1, so that you can get a sense of that and then kind of putting those restrictions on moving forward. So again, those are just a couple of examples. With that said, there is a method that I taught to my AP Psych kids that a lot of kids across this country kind of use when they're prepping for these FRQs, and it's SOTAs. It's an acronym. You'll come to find that with psychology, people love acronyms, ways to remember, mnemonic devices, whatever. And so when you're answering an FRQ question, this is kind of a way to think about how do I approach it, right? There's a lot of components to each of these questions, right? There's the scenario, there's the actual terms, there's connecting it back to the scenario. There's a lot of moving parts. So how do we break it down to be a little bit more manageable? And that's through what we call SOTAs. Basically, on a written test, our tests aren't written, so don't worry too much about this. But on a written test, you would leave yourself about 5 blank lines to answer each portion of the question. Now, that gives you, even though this is like an online Canvas input, insight into like what the expectation is for each of those terms, right? You're not writing a novel, right? You're not providing everything you've ever learned, right? You're answering the question, and you're defining that term and you're connecting it back to the scenario. It can be short and sweet if you're doing that. Making sure that you're addressing those components in order. So if we look back here, right, I'm not going to write about episodic memory and then altruism and then Broca's area and then crystallized intelligence. I'm not going to jump around randomly, right? For the reader's sake, your reader is me. For your grader's sake, put them in order. It makes it a lot easier for us to recognize, whomever's reading it, like what exactly you're answering and how you're answering it. The next piece is to define. You should always be defining terms, right? Because even if you apply it and the application isn't super clear, but you have a definition and you say an independent variable is this, I perceive this to be the independent variable, you're going to have a better chance of getting your point there than if you just kind of like go into some like willy-nilly explanation or connection. So the first step, define and then apply. So looking here, right, you're always going to have to relate that term back to the scenario. Okay, so we have spacing, order, define, apply. This is our SOTAS acronym. And synonyms. Always use a synonym. You cannot define a word by using that same word, right? If you're trying to define chunking, right, it's a memory tactic in which our brain groups together a variety of topics so that we can more easily remember them, right? If I say chunking is when we put ideas and events into chunks so that we can more likely remember them, that won't get me any credit, right? I would have to use the word group, right? Chunk, instead of chunk, I would use group, right? So always using a synonym. And then the, so that's kind of our SOTAs, right? Here's just an example. With that said, I have a couple, there's just a couple of example questions. I already kind of showed you what they're going to look like, but if you were to see these FRQ questions, right, they're going to generally have like a scenario and then some bullet points that you're going to have to connect to. Again, you're going to be putting these down in order. You're going to be defining them and applying them to that scenario or that situation. You can write them in bullet points. You can write sampling is, define, apply, and then skip a line and go down to the next one. Independent and dependent variables are this. You do not have to connect them. They do not have to flow. This is not an A push DBQ that has to have whatever, the intro and the arguments and the documents and all the stuff. Like, this is not that, right? You just have to reference sampling, define it, right? Explain how it relates to the scenario that's been given to you, and then move on. Okay, so that's what we're looking at for an FRQ. With that said, I don't know. I'm gonna stop my sharing. With that said, your Chapter 1 FRQ and all the FRQs moving forward, you are gonna have to answer 2 questions. Each question will be worth 9 points. And they're gonna be randomized. So there's like 5 to 6 questions in each test bank. So your first question is gonna be pulled from a group of 5, and your second question is gonna be pulled from a group of 5, so that everybody's getting kind of a different mix of FRQ question. These are all questions that have been used or created by the College Board so that they're consistent in terms of difficulty and content that's covered, so that no matter what question you're getting, it's going to be pretty much on par with all the rest of the questions. So just kind of reference that. If you are taking the test and your friend is taking the test an hour later, you might not have the same questions that they have. So just kind of recognize that. That's basically it. If you want to look at some more practice questions. You should all be able to access past FRQ questions from the AP exam, just to get, again, a sense of that formatting. And you can just look those up online and you can see kind of psychology FRQ questions in the past. You can get kind of a sense of what those are going to look like. Again, this first one is not timed. You can use your notes, you can use whatever resources you need, just so that you can get a sense of what the FRQ is going to be like, so that you're prepared for the next, units, chapters 2 and 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7 and 8. So you'll have 5 more FRQs after unit 1. So just kind of recognize that. That's all I've got for you guys. Do you have any questions? Okay, then what I'm going to do, I'm going to stop the recording. I'm going to end our meeting. Thank you guys for stopping in. I do appreciate it. Hopefully it was helpful. It gives you some insight and maybe alleviate some of the anxiety and stress behind like this new kind of testing platform that you guys are probably dealing with in all your classes. So if you do have questions as you're getting through content or whatever, and you need some guidance or need clarification, shoot me an email, whatever you need, I'm here. Okay.